Really appreciate it. And so now I will turn it over to our next panel moderator, Dr. Sarah Vitone, to moderate the panel entitled Dissemination of Research in the Pandemic. Dr. Vitone is faculty at Georgetown University School of Nursing and Health Studies and a bioethicist at the Pellegrino Center for Clinical Bioethics at Georgetown. Sarah has served for the past 10 years with the Regulatory Ethics and Knowledge Component with the Georgetown Howard University CTSA in Research Ethics and Participant Advocacy. Sarah, it is yours.
All right, good morning. Thank you, Dr. Sanders. I am pleased to be part of bringing to you our closing panel for the conference today. And importantly, dissemination of the science is one of the final aspects of the scientific process and the key to impact at a broader scale. The pace of the science and the information during the past year was due in part to the adjustments in publishing and data collaboration. Balancing all this, keeping with the established standards and ethics will be the focus of this panel. I am pleased to welcome two speakers to share with you their insight, their experience, and what also any changes that may have staying power. First, let me introduce Dr. Lars Berglund. He is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Clinical and Translational Science. He is a distinguished professor emeritus of medicine at UC Davis. He served as the director for the UC Davis CTSA since its inception in 2006 until 2016. And prior to that, he was the program director for the UC Davis GCRC, funded in 2004. He was Associate Dean for Research from 2006 and Vice Dean and Associate Vice Chancellor from 2016 until his retirement in 2020. He served as Interim Dean for the UC Davis School of Medicine in 2017 to 19, and Dr. Berglund received his MD and PhD from Uppsala University, Sweden, and did his residency training at the Karolinska Institute, Stockholm. He was recruited to Columbia University in 1993 and to UC Davis in 2002. He has served as PI for several NIH R01 grants and has worked in the area of lipoprotein metabolism, vascular disease, and HIV for more than 20 years. In 2020, he assumed the role as editor-in-chief of the Journal of Clinical and Translational Science. He's a respected member of several journals and grant review committees. And he will be our first speaker. I'd like to also take the time now to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Theodora Bloom, who is the executive editor of the BMJ. Dr. Bloom has a PhD in developmental cell biology from the University of Cambridge and worked as a postdoc fellow at Harvard Medical School researching cell cycle regulation. She moved into publishing as an editor on the biology team at Nature, and in 1992 joined the journal Current Biology. After a number of years helping to develop current biology and structure and chemistry and biology, first for the Current Science Group and then for Elsevier, Theo joined the beginnings of the open access movement. As the founding editor for Genome Biology, she was instrumental in the birth of the commercial open access publisher Biomed Central, where she remained for several years, ultimately as editorial director for biology. After this, she joined the nonprofit open access publisher Public Library of Science, PLOS, in 2008, first as chief editor of PLOS Biology and later as biology editorial director with additional responsibilities for PLOS Computational Biology and PLOS Genetics. She also took the lead for PLOS on issues around data access and availability, introducing PLOS's pioneering data availability policy. At the BMJ, her responsibilities include publishing business platform and operations, as well as ethical and policy matters and dealing with complaints. She is co-founder of the MedRxiv Preprint server, a collaboration between BMJ, Cold Spring Harbor Labs, and Yale University, and jointly coordinates open access and open research initiatives at BMJ. I'd like to start the panel by turning the floor over to Dr. Berglund.
Thank you very much, Sarah. This was a wonderful introduction, and I'm very, very pleased to meet Theo here on as well. And thanks for inviting me to this very interesting conference. I listened very intently to the previous presentations that I think illustrates a lot of the points that we actually are dealing with. And I'm fascinated to represent a young journal who is not, we are in our 5th year, and I'm here alongside someone who is representing a very, very established and a really important journal in the field. So first of all, I just want to tell everyone on the call that the Journal of Clinical Translational Science is really your journal. We are aspiring to be a voice for and a home for clinical and translational scientists. And much of what we publish is really has to do with processes and sort of the science really doing translational science. It started in 2017. The major focus areas we have really reflect the programs of the CTSAs and clinical research, education, implementation, translational design, research design, and so on. And we are open to all the full spectrum of translational research. But the editorial board reflects these areas and is largely recruited from CTSA and clinical and translational research science centers throughout the country. We had previously had a publication of 6 issues per year, but in this year we switched to a continuous publication. And this may sound like a big shift. In reality, probably not that much. You know, every paper that was accepted was made available immediately in its PDF format, but then we had the final format was really in distinct issues, but now that's sort of coming online continuously as paper gets accepted. We do have a couple of junior editors, and I want to beat the drum for that. Anyone interested here who are listening in, we are looking for a new set of these junior editors who are helping out with reviews and also helping me in various aspects. And I can illustrate that a little bit when we get into the COVID issues. They represent trainees that are in the KL2 program, as also in the Association of Physical Scientists, i.e. MD, PhD scholars. We did initiate thematic issues last year, and we have published 3 of those. 3 are underway, including one focused specifically on COVID-19, and we have several others in the planning stage, and I'll talk more about that in a second. So I just want to show you a little bit where we are in our development before we get into what we did in response to COVID. So in the next slide, you can see that we started on a fairly low level. These are a number of submissions per year we are getting. And you can see that we had a close to 20% increase last year, and this year is actually looking pretty brisk. We have states here that we had about 70 when I looked at the data now, and end of April we have close to 90 submissions. So I think we are likely going to pass last year's 2020 with some margin. We have increased the number of offerings that we do. We have opened for perspectives, people writing thoughts on and perspectives of various aspects of clinical and translational research. We are now also going to have a translational case study option that is starting this year. But the major publications we are really our research article and so-called special communications, which is on the next slide. So the lavender here are the research articles, and the light green are so-called special communications, and these really deal with processes of clinical and translational science, and I think that is highly relevant for the subject today, and I think we can relate to what we heard from the 3 previous speakers, who actually had to pivot and change processes and do innovations, basically on the spot, to ensure that research continues and was made possible during these circumstances. So a lot of these publications really are talking about innovations in processes and sharing these data across the nation. So what did we do then in relation to COVID? Well, it seemed pretty obvious that having the CTSA program in place, and I've sort of followed it since beginnings in 2006, And I think it's really come nicely of age. It's a fundamentally important and quite powerful program when it works in concert. And it would seem very likely that the CTSA would be at the forefront in helping researchers to develop or modify processes, innovations that ensured rapid start and high quality of clinical trials, the modifications of regulatory aspects by staying within the realms of the possible, how to deal with implementation, patient engagement, and so on. So we felt that it was a good way to go to try to spread the information as rapidly as possible, but of course still maintaining the usual criteria for quality and review. So we initiated a rapid review pathway for COVID-related submissions. The goal here was to review within 7 days. Well, that of course means that we have to have the editorial board on board. We have to have reviewers who are committed to do this, and it takes a bit of communication, it takes a bit of commitment to do that, and at the same time we are dealing with what non-COVID papers that also need to have attention and as rapid turnaround as possible. We did not do any major change regarding the review process, except for the short timeline. The way we do it at our journal is that as the editor-in-chief, I can task members of the editorial board to handle manuscripts and to select reviewers and so on. When we started this COVID, I felt that probably would result in a delay. So I took upon myself to sort of be the handling editor for those papers and directly go to recruit reviewers and monitor the review process. And it lasted for a while, but as this grew, it became sort of unwieldy, and we had to sort of come up with a more distributed system. We also had discussions with Cambridge University Press, who is our publisher, and they offered, which they had done for a number of other journals regarding COVID-related submissions, that the submission fee would be waived. And that initially was done in April. It was supposed to last until September. It continued until the end of December. And due to the volume of COVID submissions, we reverted back to a single review process for all submissions in the fall of 2020. I think the issue was that in April, it was hard to know where this was heading. And there was a burst of activity and the feeling of sort of a very acute situation. And when we get into the fall, it was clear that this is going to stay with us for a while. And we had to get into a sort of a system that had more sustainability regarding the process. And I think it's worked pretty well for us. If we look at where we are number-wise, which is next slide, we have from this year, from starting in April 2020 until March this year, we received a little bit more than 200 submissions, of which 50 were COVID manuscripts, about 25%. We looked back and we looked at how many of these were accepted, rejected, and it was pretty amazing that the rejection rate is the same for COVID papers as non-COVID papers, about 23%. I think it reflects the fact that we are a fairly young journal, that we don't have all that many submissions. I expect that we will get more choosy, so to speak, as we grow over the coming years. And we still have a number of COVID papers in review and revision. What we did see was that we actually succeeded with this sort of faster process initially, and I think that's sort of probably getting more even now. But if we look at the first decision, which is really either modify or accept or reject, 30 days versus 46 for non-COVID papers, and final decision is when a paper has been modified, coming back, and the final decision is made regarding acceptance, 46 days versus 74 days for non-COVID papers. So I think we actually had, I think that the shorter timeline seemed to work for us. Now we are a young journal. So we do not have, papers are listed on PubMed, but we do not have an impact factor. So what we can look at, and this is our publisher is helping us to keep track of that, is really how much of our papers are downloaded. And you can see that this is the growth of those. The full text downloads have grown substantially over these last 2 years, and I think we'll see even more this year. And it also looks at abstracts used. I think the way this is counted changed a little bit in 2021. That's why the abstract use seems to drop dramatically. But I think it has more to do with the definition for the publisher. And what we did see, interestingly enough, was in the next slide, was that of the top 10 downloaded papers we had last year, 7 addressed COVID. So it is pretty clear that the area of COVID is really something that people are looking for. And I think it's very interesting in 2021 to see if this is sustained to the same level. And we did also, during the year, we were approached by the CTSA steering committee, and who wondered if we were interested in creating or actually having a thematic issue of papers related to COVID. And we were quite excited by that, and we worked with the CTSA steering committee, and the COVID thematic issue is essentially now complete. It will be published very, very soon, and I think I would encourage you to go to our website where we have these thematic issues collected. We have 3 published so far. It's about implementation and dissemination science, rural health, and data science. The COVID will be the 4th. And you can see here the areas that are covered. And I think it actually speaks to the presentations we heard before by Drs. Ash, Dowell, and Smith, that they talk about virtual visits, informed consent processes, modifying testing, IRB procedures, and so on. These are some of the papers and subject of these papers in this thematic issue. So, and I think that's going to be quite useful in sharing this information. So what are the lessons learned, at least for us? Well, it's important to offer flexibility and to engage our reviewers and the editorial board members as stakeholders in the process. This journal we do not have a large administration. It's me as part-time editor-in-chief, and we have one person who actually helps me keep track of all the handling of the manuscripts. So our ability to do a lot of sort of administrative processes is limited, and we're trying to do to spend our energy on the things that we think can have the most impact on the process. I think it's important to maintain focus on quality and content and not be carried away by the speed here. And we are now working with the publisher to further communicate and market these publications and make sure that they have as wide distribution as possible. And I think that's for me, closing for me, and I thank you for the opportunity to participate, and I look forward to the discussion later on.
Hi, thanks Lars, and thanks Sarah for inviting me. I'm very aware I stand between people and their lunch, so I will try not to take more of your time than is necessary. Talking again about how we're disseminating research and how that's changed in the pandemic. Next slide, please. In terms of my competing interests, the key thing to know about me is that I'm a full-time editor at the BMJ, which is a journal published by the British Medical Association, and I'm also the founder of the MedRxiv preprint server, and those are the 2 things I'm going to talk about today. Next slide, please. I just want to situate when we talk about the dissemination of research. You know, in this ideal world, when I was taught about it, you do research, you prepare to share it, you share it with the world, you read other people's sharing of their work, discuss the ideas, and do some more research. Next slide, please. That's pretty much how it worked for sort of 150 years, I think, where at first the sharing was in person and then it became written. And you may recognize a famous paper from the 1950s, you know, steal someone else's data, write a short article about it, win a Nobel Prize. That's what we're all aiming for here. Next slide, please. But the real world as experienced now, and by now I mean the last decade or more, is that after you've written up that description of your research, you submit it to a journal, it might be rejected, you try somewhere else, or you're asked to do more work, you resubmit, eventually you get publication. And why is that so important? Because you're judged by publications in order to get grants, to get promotions and tenure, and so on. So that rather simple dissemination cycle has become very bloated. Next slide, please. And part of the bloat leads to a bias in the system towards positive results, and it's very slow. It's a slow way of sharing information. Next slide, please. So preprints aim to cut off all that bloat, speed things up again. And they just say, when you've written a description of your work, share it with the world, let other people read it. Next slide, please. And it's quite easy to make the case for preprints. They speed things up. Preprints, back when I was a lab scientist, a preprint was a physical manuscript that you posted to the half a dozen labs around the world who worked on the same thing as you. These days, we have the internet. You don't have to post it, and you can let anyone read it. And that's obviously going to help them know what you've been working on a few months sooner than if they wait for journal publication. It also helps you get feedback from more people than just a couple of peer reviewers. And everyone knows if you post it publicly on a preprint server, what date you posted, you get your precedence. It may even be a way of surfacing things that don't survive peer review. But when we talk about clinical medicine, the worry has always been, what if we post something that's wrong? What if we cause a major scare? We stop people taking important medication in general? How do we make sure that we're nevertheless doing good for science and for health when we post preprints? Next slide, please. So we launched MedRxiv. Sorry, the fonts are rather small on these. Basically, it is, people may have heard of bioRxiv a while ago, around the mid-2010s. It started posting basic science preprints. It's a not-for-profit server. bioRxiv and MedRxiv both run out of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory in New York. But in the case of MedRxiv, we manage it in partnership between BMJ, colleagues at Yale University who are working clinicians, and the folks at Cold Spring Harbor Lab. It launched in late 2019, and it initially had no support except the launching organizations, but now has some philanthropic support from the Chan Zuckerberg initiative. Next slide, please. And so when we thought about posting preprints in clinical medicine as a way to speed up the science, we said there are basically two things we're going to ask of what we post. Is it original research article? And does it follow the norms of reporting? We thought those were fairly basic sort of questions to ask, but I will tell you that the 20% of things that we declined to post at MedRxiv during the pandemic, it was either that they weren't research articles or they didn't follow those norms. And by norms, I mean having ethical oversight for research you do, registering trials on a clinical trials registry and so on, not incredibly demanding requirements. This is not peer review, this is just basics that would be checked at submission at a journal. Thank you. So basically, when we screen articles, we are asking, is there a benefit to sharing this article now rather than waiting until it's been peer reviewed? So we want it to be science written up as a research article, not plagiarized, and not providing a threat to health. And that, do we see a risk to health, turns out to be a reason we turn away a tiny, tiny number of articles, but I may point to some examples of why we do that. Next slide, please. If you ever look at a preprint from MedRxiv or look at the site itself, you'll see a lot of warnings. We warn people, these are not peer-reviewed, these are not clinical advice. and we urge journalists not to report them as if they're established scientific fact. Next slide, please. When I prepared these slides a couple of weeks ago, between MedRxiv and bioRxiv, we had posted more than 15,000 articles on COVID alone, and MedRxiv's around 15,000 articles in total. Obviously, a very large hit of COVID since we launched in 2019. Next slide, please. And this is what our version of pandemic growth looked like. So by January last year, when we were 6 months old, we were receiving 9 or 10 articles a day for posting. That doubled in February, doubled again in March, doubled again in April, such that we were in the middle, in the middle of the height of things, getting up to 100 articles a day for screening and posting. And we were extremely pleased to be able to still post within 3 or 4 days of submission of an article, and quite a lot of people revise after posting as they get feedback on their articles. Next slide, please. The usage of preprints did a similar thing, and we have sort of tens of millions of views every day now. Next slide, please. So a lot of people have recognized during the pandemic the value of preprints. NIH did a pilot of mandating preprint deposition in PubMed Central. Europe, PubMed Central did that. If you receive things as I do, like the Nature Daily Briefing, it will often highlight for you what's in a preprint, because that is a way of knowing what's happening in science sooner than waiting for published articles. But next slide, please. There's a lot of people worried about their misuse. Is this torrent of research being produced uncritically and without sufficient caveats and warnings? Next slide. So here's one example of why I think preprints have really earned their place in this pandemic. In June of last year, the UK's chief medical officer wrote to physicians in the UK and said, "We have the results of a clinical trial that mean you should start prescribing dexamethasone for seriously ill patients with COVID." That was a press release and a letter. A week later, we got the preprint posted, so you could actually see all the data from the trial on which this letter and press release were based. And you'll see a note on the preprint saying now published in New England Journal of Medicine. Next click, please. The New England Journal published the article about a month after the preprint. Now that's fantastically fast for a journal to have done peer review, formatted publication, editing, and so on. But even so, it was a month during which thousands of lives were saved. A third of people who are seriously ill in hospital or on ventilators had their lives saved by the use of dexamethasone. And I, for one, would prefer that they used the full information available in the preprint reporting the data than that they simply took a letter and a press release to explain why they should do that. Next slide. We did have some problems. You'll remember President Trump promoting hydroxychloroquine. That was actually on the basis of a peer-reviewed article, although it was peer-reviewed and published about 2 days after the preprint was posted. He was also referring to preprints showing the opposite result as enemy statements. This certainly made it more, what's the word? We were more careful about what we posted and how it could be misinterpreted when the stakes were as high as this. Next slide, please. A lot of people suggest that preprints are fine, but they should only be available to qualified people, whether that's doctors, researchers, or something else. They shouldn't be allowed to be public. The problem I have with this is twofold. First of all, I think some people who aren't qualified nevertheless make serious contributions, and we've seen that during COVID, people doing analysis and studies that are at least as good as qualified researchers are doing. But secondly, is there not a risk there that you exclude all sorts of people from parts of the world whose qualifications you don't recognize and so on? So I think we have, I don't think that's the answer, but I do understand that it's often suggested. Next slide, please. So I want to switch gears and talk about the BMJ, and as Lars suggested, the BMJ is the other end of the age spectrum from his journal and from MedRxiv. We've been going nearly 200 years. And we still exist in print as well as online. We still publish research articles as we ever did, but actually also right from the beginning, it's been a campaigning and journalistic organ as well as a research one. Next slide, please. And it's part of a journal portfolio on other clinical subjects, including a large number of open access articles, as well as some that still have subscription content. Next slide, please. And all of them, I've just given you some samples, saw the kind of increase in submissions as COVID hit, mostly doubling or 50% up, not the kind of 10-fold increase that MedRxiv saw. And for the BMJ, we stay at sort of 50% higher submissions than we were before the pandemic. And that's pretty challenging for journals to deal with. Next slide, please. Because when we peer review, I mean, in fact, for the BMJ, a number of articles are turned away without peer review by the editors. But when we do peer review, it involves a team of editors, at least 3 academic reviewers, often a statistical reviewer. We include patients in peer review. There's a lot of people involved. There's usually at least 1 or 2 iterations of the article before it's ready for publication. It's prepared with associated editorial commentary, graphics, and so on. This is a heavyweight process, and I think somewhat inevitably takes weeks, not days, to complete. Next slide, please. And it's particularly challenging when the editors are all working from home, homeschooling their children, and in the kind of environment I think everyone's been familiar with in the pandemic. But I don't want to make a plea especially for us. Next slide, please, because those of our colleagues who were also clinicians were working very much harder on the front line. I think we were all happy to take a bit more of the weight off their shoulders so they could be doing the serious work. Next slide, please. Like most journals, we made freely available, we continue to make freely available all the information we publish on COVID. That includes all news and journalism as well as all research articles, and that's true across the BMJ portfolio. And obviously, long-term, that's not a sustainable proposition, especially as it represents an increasing proportion of everything we're publishing. But at the moment, it is so clearly the right thing to do that we wouldn't have it any other way. Next slide, please. And I think it behoves us to ask what's the sweet spot here, and we need to speed up journal publication. The whole case for preprints relies on the idea that journal publication is a bit slow. Before the pandemic, it was estimated at about 4 months from submission to publication was an average journal, and there are certainly cases of very much longer than that. And why is it okay? I mean, clearly COVID has given us all an enormous sense of urgency, but do we really want to say that in the case of cancer or Parkinson's or, you know, name your favorite disease, that there is no urgency to get the research out there and into the clinic as fast as possible? Next slide. I think journals have a lot we do a lot of work that isn't just publish the research. 2 examples are here. We've launched living systematic reviews, which aren't just a static description of the best in class, but carry on being updated. And this is an example of a living systematic review about treatments for COVID, I think. And we're working with a team called Magic, who aim to get systematic reviews produced within 90 days of a new research result coming out. They aim to add it to a systematic review and have that published. And so that's still pretty fast for people to have done all the analysis and so on, but it does take time, and it is a lot more contextualized than the rough and ready preprint posting. Next slide. So this is really a question. Will this help, all this preprinting and the torrent of work? Clearly, there is an issue with waste in research in general. Glazio and colleagues had pointed that out some time ago, and they've repeated it for COVID. There's a lot of the work done is not useful and not optimal. On the other hand, as you see from the graphs on the right-hand side, in previous pandemics, epidemics, we didn't even publish the work about Zika until the crisis was over, and the same with the early Ebola problems. But in the case of SARS, first of all, the pandemic is lasting longer, but the first research was being published within days and weeks of the first cases being identified, and that, I think, has to be better for all of us. Next slide. Finally, I just want to acknowledge again that while I've been speaking from BMJ, the MedRxiv in particular is a big collaboration with the folks you see on the slide. So I'll stop there so we have time for some questions. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Bloom and Dr. Berglund, for your very thoughtful presentations, and you're bringing forth some really interesting aspects to the science, and I appreciate that. From a staying power, you start to highlight, you know, the idea of how can we press forward for these other important science. Do you see some staying power in this rapid review process? Let me ask Dr. Bloom first. You started that comment.
Well, I'm sorry to say that I think the problem at the moment is that stops are being pulled out to do really rapid review of COVID content, and it may even be making matters worse for non-COVID content, because, you know, editors and reviewers are 100% focused on doing that as fast as they can, and that does mean a little bit of a knock-on effect on the rest. I do think there's probably a sweet spot. I don't think that 2 weeks is a reasonable amount of time to fully produce and prepare a research article for publication, but I think it's something less than 4 months. So I see a pressure to get us, you know, somewhere faster than the slowest of old, but I'm not sure it'll be as fast as we're seeing with COVID. And for me, preprints are one answer to that. Make it available to the expert eye sooner, but have the journal peer review go on in parallel and see the end point of that a couple of months later.
Thank you. Dr. Berglund.
Yeah, I agree. I think if you think about who the reviewers are, they are us, right? And us right now are pulled in every possible direction. So I think one has to take a little bit of a long view regarding sustainability, because if you wear reviewers down, you know, they have to do their, you know, as much as I do about this, they ask to do lots and lots and lots of things, and I think you have to sort of treat them with respect and have them to become you know, repeat customers, in the sense that you have to go back to them from time to time because they get used to the journal. So I do think, you know, look, so obviously I'm new at this compared to Theo, but I in looking at the sort of inefficiencies, I think there are ways we can deal with that actually affect the time. For example, I noticed that some of our people on the editorial board really don't get around to ask reviewers for a week, right? So we can cut those things down. We had, you know, when I came in, our journal was giving reviewers 3 weeks of time. I was thinking, you know, I'm asked to do 7 days for JAMA, I'm asked to do 2 weeks for virtually every other journal. Why don't we, you know, shorten this to 2 weeks? I mean, because I'm sure that the reviewer is just going to sit on it for 17 days and then do the thing at the last 4 days anyhow. So you might as well move that up. So I think there are things we can do regarding efficiency. And then as I said, the fact that we have moved from issues to continuous publications mean that it's a little bit harder to pull these thematic issues together. But so if you have 15 papers in a thematic issue, any paper that's accepted gets out, right? So you have to sort of pull them up at the end and then highlight that area if you want to create some buzz around that theme. But they are available as soon as they are accepted. So, and interestingly, Thea, I can tell you that we looked into MedRxiv, and we actually scouted over MedRxiv in the beginning and invited some people, papers to submit to us, and we got a number of papers that I thought would be good fits for us. So I think it's a very valuable resource. Actually, the issue is, as you're victims of your own success to some extent. It's a huge volume of paper.
Thank you. I also, I was going to ask that, Dr. Bloom, do you know approximately how many of your preprints actually go on?
To be published in journals.
Yeah.
We don't have good information for MedRxiv yet. What I can tell you for bioRxiv, the number is that 70% are published within 2 years. Now that's actually quite worrying, isn't it? That A, there's 30% that aren't published in 2 years, and B, that takes up to 2 years for some things to be published after they've been posted. But it may be that we're saving journal editors time by, you know, if people hear all the feedback on the article before it is published in a journal and decide to go away and, you know, revise it extensively, that's probably not a bad thing.
I'd like to ask you a question about some of the articles that have been retracted, and if you could comment on that. But before I do that, there's a question in the chat that is, I don't know if it's related to just the timing, and you commented on people working from home, whether you saw more articles being submitted from women or men.
So actually, this is a really good question, and we've done a bit of research across BMJ that we're hoping to publish on this, because there's been a very marked change in gender of first and last authors, and that is many more men than women. And the assumption is that women have once again reverted to having to take on childcare and home management. And that maybe men have actually been freed up from some of their other work responsibilities and they're able to write lots of papers. But it is a worry that across subject areas and across geographies, we've seen the pandemic means we go back to many more male authors than female.
Thank you for that. So if I could ask either one of you to comment on the number of retractions or things that you have seen during the time of the pandemic.
I'll give it a go, and then Lars, you can comment. I mean, you know, notably there were a couple of publications in high-profile journals that were retracted very quickly, and where it turned out that actually nobody had ever seen the data, including many of the co-authors. And I think that, I don't entirely blame the journals for that. You know, the authors undertake that they've seen the data and validated it. And the fact that that hadn't happened probably reflected everyone wanting to believe the authors who said they had the data. But it's taught us all something about ensuring transparency in those areas. I think there's some, you know, personally, I don't think you should retract papers just because they're wrong, right? Lots of papers are wrong. You sort of, that's how the edifice builds. You know, a paper that finds 100 people benefited from hydroxychloroquine isn't necessarily wrong. Those 100 people did. It's just that when you look at thousands of people, they don't benefit. So I think there've been a lot more sort of corrections than retractions. And some of the retractions have taught us things about how science should work. Lars, I don't know what you...
Yeah, I don't think we have all that much to add. I think if you look at our journal, it's although it's sort of open to everything, it's pretty unlikely, I would say, that we will get a lot of these sort of initial basic science or more laboratory-based studies. So the papers we get are more process-oriented, and they probably are somewhat later in the you know, when more experience has been gathered and so on. So we have had no issues or detractions, but we probably haven't had those high-profile submissions that you know, are urgent news, so to speak, but also maybe high risk regarding, you know, those issues.
It seems like these are part of the staying with the routine ethics and review process.
Right.
Just to ask also around preprints, how in the, you did describe a process of before they're posted. How was how are they surveyed related to, say, preventing plagiarism or even self-plagiarism among preprints? Yeah.
Sorry, did you say how do we check, or how? Yeah, so we run all preprints through an automated system called Authenticate, which picks up any published work and posted preprints. What it doesn't do is if people submit 2 or 3 things at once that are very similar, that relies on us picking it up. And we do allow probably a slightly higher match than a journal might, but it's usually in areas like the methods or whatever that have been repeated, what you might call self-plagiarism. So we don't post anything that's been posted in a very similar form elsewhere.
So on that note, could you comment on the few, was it about 20%, I think you said, that did not post to preprint?
So the vast majority of those were no ethical oversight, and not what we have allowed is if people said, oh, we didn't need ethical oversight for that, if we were inclined to agree with them that an ethics committee would waive that, then we invite them to get an ethics committee to say so. But if they've actually done something interventional with people and should have had ethical oversight, there's no way they can get that retrospectively, and we don't allow it. That's a very large proportion, and a really scary. I mean, we had a letter from a physician in the UK saying, I know this works, this treatment I'm giving it to every patient I see, you have to post this. And this was an unlicensed, untested, unoverseen treatment. We had the same from people in the US using something that the FDA labels dangerous and not to be used for any human purpose, telling us that this thing would treat COVID. So there was really quite a lot of that. There was a lot of not research articles. So, you know, we've all seen a lot of blog posts, a lot of newspaper articles that have some data and analysis in them. And we had to work out how to draw the line. And in our view, it was, is there a research question? So someone who just has described, you know, this is how the pandemic's developing in our country, and this is what happened after we locked down, we decided that's not a research article, that's a newspaper report effectively. So it's mainly things that simply were not research or not adequately reported.
Well, I really appreciate your comments today, because the clinicians are counting on the science to be published in a way that is provides the strength that they need to be able to treat. So I appreciate your time and your expertise today. I'd like to thank both my panelists, and now I'm going to turn over the conference to